In the heart of the city, where shadows blend with the fog and the rain blurs the lines between right and wrong, Detective Ethan Graves sat alone in his apartment. It was one of those nights, the kind that brought back old memories. The smell of rain, the quiet hum of the city below, and the whiskey in his hand. They were the only companions he needed. But peace in this city never lasted long. The phone rang, a sound he had come to expect, a signal that trouble had arrived once again. On the other end, a young officer's voice, jittery with urgency. "Detective Graves," the officer said, "there's been a murder. You'll want to see this one." Graves moved with a purpose. There was something in the officer's tone, a sharpness, a tension. It wasn't the usual call, the kind that blurred into the background of his daily grind. No, this was different. As he stepped into the rain-soaked streets, the city whispered to him, there was death in the air tonight. At Briarwood Apartments, the scene was already swarming with uniforms. Blue and red lights flickered against the glass doors, casting ghostly reflections on the slick streets. Graves stepped out of the car, his coat pulled tight against the storm. The young officer, Charlie, met him at the entrance, face pale and eyes wide. The kid couldn't have been more than a few years on the force, still fresh enough to be rattled by what lay upstairs. Graves and Charlie rode the elevator in silence, the hum of the machinery amplifying the tension. The doors slid open, revealing the penthouse hallway. And at the end of that hall, a life had ended in silence. Graves moved closer, crouching beside her body. There were no signs of a struggle. Whoever had done this had been careful, precise. Forensics confirmed it. No forced entry. No fight, just a quiet, deliberate death. Victoria Langston had known her killer. Across the room, a soft glow illuminated the desk. A laptop left open its screen, revealing the last piece of the puzzle Victoria Langston had tried to solve herself. Graves leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read the message on the screen. "To Mr. H, we need to talk. If you don't come clean, I will. I've kept your secret long enough. It was a warning. Or maybe a plea. But whoever Mr. H was, Victoria had been right. Keeping secrets had gotten her killed." Charlie appeared at the doorway, holding up a bagged evidence item, a bottle of wine with 2 glasses. One of them still had traces of lipstick, a subtle shade of red, now dulled in the stark light of the crime scene. She hadn't been alone, Graves thought. She'd been sharing a drink with her killer. Graves handed the glasses to the forensics team. He didn't need to say anything, his mind was already moving ahead. Whoever had been with her that night had left behind more than just a broken promise. Now it was up to Graves to figure out who Mr. H was, and why Victoria Langston had to die to protect his secret. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, everything was eerily quiet. Graves stood by the window, looking out over the city that seemed to go on, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up and vanishing into the dark. Somewhere out there, Mr. H was waiting, but Graves knew he wouldn't stay hidden for long. Shadows had a way of coming to light, even in a city like this. Far from the crime scene, in a dimly lit room, someone else was typing, deleting, a final message erased from the digital traces Victoria had left behind. A voice, calm, collected, spoke into the receiver. "It's done," the voice said. "No more loose ends." And then with a soft click, the line went dead. In a city of shadows, no one is ever truly safe. And for Detective Graves, this was only the beginning. The hunt for Mr. H had just begun, and Victoria Langston's secrets were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Next time, on Silent Shadows. The city never sleeps, and neither does death. The morning after Victoria Langston's murder brought no answers, only more questions. For Detective Ethan Graves, the storm outside had passed, but inside his mind, the clouds were just beginning to gather. Somewhere in the shadows, a killer waited. And Graves knew it wouldn't be long before the hunt would begin in earnest. His phone buzzed a message from the lab. They'd found something in Victoria's laptop. Something worth a second look. The police tech lab was a sterile place cold, humming with machinery and the glow of monitors. But it was also the key to finding out what Victoria Langston had tried to uncover before she died. The lab tech showed Graves what they had found, an email exchange buried deep in Victoria's inbox. It was between her and a man she called Mr. H. Their messages were brief, cold, filled with the tension of a business deal gone wrong. Victoria had been demanding a meeting. She wanted Mr. H to come clean. "If you don't, I will," she wrote. "You have until tomorrow." Graves could feel the weight of those words. She had been playing a dangerous game, and it had cost her her life. The last message from Mr. H suggested a meeting at a private club downtown, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Graves knew what he had to do. It was time to visit the shadows where secrets lived. The club was hidden in plain sight, an old building with no sign, just a red awning and a doorman who looked like he'd seen it all. Graves approached, his eyes scanning the crowd. This was a place for people who didn't want to be seen. And somewhere inside, Mr. H was hiding. Graves flashed his badge to the doorman, who hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and whispers. The lighting was low, casting long shadows over the plush furniture. This wasn't just a club, it was a sanctuary for the powerful and the corrupt. At the bar, Graves spotted a familiar face: Jackson, an old informant who had traded the streets for the safety of managing places like this. Jackson had always been slippery, but he owed Graves a few favors. The detective approached, and Jackson's face tensed. "Ethan Graves," Jackson muttered, his voice low and cautious. "Didn't think I'd see you here. What's the trouble?" Graves didn't mince words. He told Jackson about Victoria Langston, about Mr. H, and about the secrets that had gotten her killed. Jackson leaned in, his eyes scanning the room as if someone might be listening. He told Graves about a man named Harrison, a regular at the club, always sharp-dressed and quiet, but with an air of danger that made people keep their distance. He had been seen with Victoria more than once. Graves slid a few bills across the bar, a silent payment for Jackson's information. But as he did, Jackson's words echoed in his mind. "Be careful, Ethan. Harrison's connected. You don't want to be caught in his web." Graves didn't respond. He had dealt with men like Harrison before. Dangerous, yes, but not untouchable. And if Harrison was the key to Victoria Langston's murder, Graves wasn't about to let him slip away. The private room was dimly lit, with deep red curtains and leather chairs that smelled of wealth and secrets. Seated in one of those chairs was Harrison, a man who fit the description perfectly. Tall, well-dressed, with slick-back hair and cold eyes that showed no fear when he looked at Graves. "Detective Graves," Harrison said, his voice calm and controlled. "I've been expecting you." There was no shock in his expression, no surprise that Graves had tracked him down. In fact, it seemed like Harrison had been waiting for this moment. Graves wasted no time. He brought up Victoria Langston's name, watching carefully for any crack in Harrison's facade. But Harrison just smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill through the room. Victoria was complicated, Harrison admitted, though his tone remained detached. "We had business dealings, but I had nothing to do with her death." His words were smooth, too smooth, like a man who had rehearsed this conversation before. Graves wasn't buying it. He'd seen men like Harrison before, men who operated in the shadows, keeping their hands clean while pulling strings from behind the scenes. Victoria had been close to something dangerous. And whatever it was, Harrison wasn't going to give it up easily. As Graves turned to leave, Harrison's voice followed him out the door cone, almost amused. "Good luck, Detective," he said. "You'll need it." Graves stepped out into the cooling evening air, Harrison's words still lingering in his mind. He knew better than to trust a man like that. Harrison was hiding something, and it wouldn't be long before Graves uncovered it. The call was from Dr. Claire Mason at the morgue. She had found something: new traces of an unknown substance in Victoria Langston's system. It wasn't just a clean-cut murder. She had been drugged first. Victoria had been drugged before she was killed. It was another piece of the puzzle, another clue leading back to Mr. H. But what was it she had known? What secret had been so dangerous that it had cost her her life? Far from the noise of the city, in a room bathed in shadow, someone else was working, erasing the traces of Victoria Langston's last days. "It's done," the voice said softly. "No more loose ends." Graves was getting closer to the truth, but the shadows were closing in fast. Harrison, Mr. H, and the web of lies that had led to Victoria Langston's death, they were all still out there. And the deeper Graves dug, the more dangerous the game became. Next time, on Silent Shadows. In a city filled with secrets, it's the quietest ones that scream the loudest. Detective Ethan Graves had spent years walking these streets, uncovering lies and chasing shadows. But this case, Victoria Langston's murder, was different. It wasn't just about money or power. This was personal. And the deeper Graves dug, the more dangerous the game became. Morning, outside Victoria Langston's gallery. Victoria Langston's gallery stood silent in the morning light, its once vibrant windows now dark and uninviting. The art that had once filled the space with life was hidden behind locked doors and shuttered windows. Graves had come here looking for answers. He knew that somewhere inside, Victoria had left a trace of her secrets, something that could tie Mr. H to her death. The gallery was a labyrinth of shadows and memories, filled with paintings that seemed to watch Graves as he moved through the rooms. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil paint, but beneath it all, Graves could sense something else, something hidden just beneath the surface. Victoria had been meticulous, every detail of her life, every transaction, every relationship cataloged in notebooks and ledgers. But there was one file, buried deep in the drawer, that caught Graves' attention. It was marked only with a single letter. Inside the folder were contracts, emails, and photos, evidence of a partnership between Victoria and a man named Harrison. But this wasn't just a business deal. It was something darker, something twisted. Graves knew that whatever had bound them together had also led to Victoria's death. Graves had what he needed: proof that Victoria and Harrison were connected. But now the question was how far that connection went, and what Harrison was willing to do to keep it buried. Police station, Graves' office. Afternoon, back at the station, Graves studied the documents carefully. The deeper he looked, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Victoria and Harrison. There were others involved: business partners, investors, people with a lot to lose if the truth ever got out. The call came from Dr. Claire Mason at the morgue. She had more information about the drug found in Victoria's system. It wasn't something they saw every day: an untraceable sedative, designed to leave no trace. Whoever had killed Victoria had been careful, precise. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. Graves knew he was dealing with someone dangerous, someone who had planned every detail of Victoria's death. But he also knew that they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. Harrison's office. Evening, Harrison's office was a fortress of glass and steel, towering above the city like a monument to power. But even fortresses had their cracks. Graves had found the cracked Victoria's file, and now it was time to confront Harrison with the evidence. Harrison was waiting for him, seated behind a sleek glass desk, his eyes calm and cold. He didn't flinch as Graves entered, didn't show a hint of fear. But Graves could see it, just beneath the surface. Harrison was worried. He just didn't want to admit it. "We both know Victoria didn't die by accident," Graves said, his voice steady. "And we both know you had something to do with it." Harrison's response was smooth, as expected. He denied everything, claiming that his relationship with Victoria had been purely professional. But Graves wasn't buying it. The proof was right there on the desk and tracks, emails, photos. It was all there, laid out in black and white. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Graves. "You're digging into things you don't understand, Detective," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'd be careful if I were you. Some secrets are better left buried." Graves didn't flinch. He'd heard threats like that before. But as he stepped out into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that Harrison was right about one thing. This case was bigger than he had imagined. And the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. Alleyway outside Harrison's office. Night. Graves stepped into the cold night air. The rain falling harder now, drenching the city in darkness. He had pushed Harrison, but he knew it wasn't enough. Harrison was connected, protected. But that didn't mean he was untouchable. Graves' instincts kicked in as he heard the sound, just for a moment. A car engine revving too fast. He turned, eyes narrowing, just in time to see a dark sedan speeding down the alley toward him. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him as the car sped past, its headlights vanishing into the rain. For a moment, everything was quiet, the only sound the steady drip of water from the alley's rooftops. Someone had tried to silence him, but whoever it was, they had failed. Graves wiped the rain from his face, his mind already racing with possibilities. The warning had been clear, he was getting too close to the truth. But instead of backing off, it only made him more determined. In the quiet of a darkened room, someone else was making their move. Fingers tapped against a keyboard, deleting messages, erasing evidence. A phone rang, and once again, a familiar voice answered. "It's done," the voice said. "But there's a problem. Graves. He's not backing down." Graves had survived the first attempt on his life, but the danger was far from over. The shadows were closing in, and the people pulling the strings were getting desperate. But for Graves, there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, somewhere in the dark, and he wouldn't stop until he found it. Next time, on Silent Shadows. In a city that hides its truths in the shadows, every step forward feels like a step deeper into the dark. Detective Ethan Graves had survived one attempt on his life, but the people pulling the strings weren't finished with him yet. Victoria Langston's murder had been the opening move, and now, with every clue Graves uncovered, the danger grew. Graves' apartment, early morning. Graves answered the phone on the first ring. It was Dr. Claire Mason from the morgue, her voice tense. She had new evidence about Victoria Langston's murder. The drug found in her system had been traced back to an underground supplier. It was rare, nearly impossible to find on the streets. Whoever had used it had connections, deep ones. Graves scribbled the name down, an elusive dealer known only as Zio. He worked the edges of the city's underworld, dealing in substances most people had never heard of. If Mr. H had gone to Zhao for the drug, it meant one thing: he wasn't just another businessman. He was deeply entrenched in the city's criminal network. Graves knew what he had to do. Zhao was dangerous, unpredictable. But if he could find him, he'd be one step closer to Mr. H, and one step closer to uncovering the truth about Victoria Langston's murder. Chinatown. Afternoon. Chinatown was a maze of narrow streets and hidden alleyways, a place where secrets thrived. Graves moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of the people he passed. He was looking for someone who could lead him to Zhao. The shop was small, cluttered with trinkets and shadows. An old man sat behind the counter, his eyes sharp and knowing. Graves had been here before years ago, on a different case, but the man hadn't changed. He had connections all over Chinatown, and Graves knew he could point him in the right direction. The man didn't ask questions, he never did. But he handed Graves a slip of paper with an address scrawled on it. Zhao, the man said quietly, doesn't like visitors. Be careful. Abandoned warehouse, evening. The address led Graves to the outskirts of the city, to an old warehouse that had long been forgotten by the world. It was the kind of place where deals were made in the dark, where people disappeared without a trace. Graves wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of place he expected to find Zhao. The inside of the warehouse was cold, empty except for a few scattered crates and the sound of dripping water echoing from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood Zhao, a thin man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor that made Graves uneasy. He wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, their expressions cold, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. Zhao didn't waste time. You're here for answers, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But answers come at a price. Graves had expected as much. He told Zhao about the drug used in Victoria Langston's murder, about Mr. H. Zhao listened, his expression never changing. But when Graves finished, Zhao smiled a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down Graves' spine. Mr. H. Zhao repeated, almost to himself. He is not a man you find easily. But I can tell you this, he is more dangerous than you know. He has powerful friends, and he does not forgive those who betray him. Zhao didn't give Graves a name, but he gave him something better, a lead. There's a man, Zhao said, who handles Mr. H's dirty work. His name is Kincaid. If you find Kincaid, you'll find Mr. H. But be careful, detective. Kincaid doesn't leave loose ends. As Graves stepped out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Zhao had been right. He was getting closer to Mr. H, but the closer he got, the more dangerous the game became. Dark alley, night, Graves moved quickly through the rain-soaked streets, his mind racing with everything he had learned. Kincaid was the key, he knew it. But finding Kincaid wouldn't be easy. The man was a ghost, operating in the shadows, cleaning up the messes left behind by men like Mr. H. But Graves wasn't alone. He could feel it, the presence of someone following him. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side, but it was too late. The hit came fast and hard, knocking the wind out of him. Graves hit the ground, gasping for breath as the rain poured down around him. A figure loomed over him, their face hidden in the darkness. Stay away from Kincaid, the figure growled, their voice low and threatening. Or next time, you won't get up. Graves wiped the blood from his mouth, his body aching from the attack. The warning had been clear, he was getting too close to the truth. But instead of backing off, it only fueled his determination. Whoever had sent that message didn't know Graves. He wasn't the kind of man who backed down. In the quiet of a darkened room, someone else was preparing for the next move. Fingers tapped against a keyboard, deleting files, erasing traces of conversations that had never happened. A phone rang softly in the background, and a voice answered. Graves is still digging, the voice said. But it won't be long now. Kincaid will take care of him. Detective Ethan Graves had spent years chasing criminals through the shadows of the city, but nothing had prepared him for this. The closer he got to Mr. H, the more dangerous the game became. Kincaid, the enforcer, the man who cleaned up after Mr. H, was the key to unlocking everything. But finding him meant walking deeper into the abyss. The sound of rain taps lightly against the window. Inside, it's quieter. the hum of the city distant but ever present. The faint ticking of a clock echoes in the background. Graves sits in his dimly lit apartment, looking over notes and photographs. His breath is heavy, tired but focused. Graves sat alone in his apartment, the rain outside matching the storm that brewed in his mind. The photos on the table in front of him were a map of connections: Victoria Langston, Harrison, Zhao, and now Kincaid. He had been following Kincaid's trail for days, but the man was like a ghost, always one step ahead. The phone buzzed, pulling Graves from his thoughts. It was Charlie, the young officer who had been helping Graves with the case. Charlie had news someone had spotted Kincaid. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Graves' chair creaks as he stands, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he heads for the door. Graves grabbed his coat, the weight of the investigation hanging heavy on his shoulders. He knew that if he found Kincaid, he'd be closer to finding Mr. H, but he also knew that every step toward the truth put him deeper in the crosshairs. The door clicks shut behind him, and the sound of rain grows louder as Graves steps outside. The rain continues to fall harder now against metal rooftops and broken pavement. The wind whistles through the deserted industrial area, adding a sense of desolation to the scene. Graves' footsteps echo as he moves cautiously down a narrow alleyway. The industrial district was a wasteland of abandoned factories and crumbling warehouses, left behind by a city that had moved on. It was the perfect place for someone like Kincaid to hide. Graves moved quietly through the shadows, his senses on high alert. He could feel it. Kincaid was close. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot, distant footsteps from someone else moving in the dark. Graves slows his pace, listening intently. Then, Graves heard it, a faint sound, barely noticeable over the rain. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the shadows ahead. He drew his gun, his eyes scanning the darkness. Kincaid was there, he could feel it. The footsteps stop. A tense silence fills the air, broken only by the sound of rain and wind. Graves' breathing grows heavier, tension building. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the darkness, a voice spoke low, calm, and filled with menace. "You shouldn't have come here, Detective," Kincaid said. "This isn't a place for people who ask too many questions." The voice of Kincaid is rough, hardened by years of working in the shadows. Graves remains silent, but the tension is palpable. Graves didn't respond. He stepped forward, his gun still raised, his eyes searching for the source of the voice. But Kincaid was a master at this game. He moved like a shadow, slipping in and out of sight with ease. A pause, the sound of movement in the dark as Kincaid shifts positions. Kincaid's voice echoed through the alley again. "You want answers, Graves? You won't find them here. The people I work for, they don't leave loose ends." Graves takes a slow breath, his grip tightening on the gun. Graves had heard enough. He stepped forward, into the darkness, but Kincaid was already gone. The alley was empty, save for the sound of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Graves lowers his gun slowly, his breathing steady but heavy. Footsteps retreat into the distance as Graves walks away. Kincaid had slipped through his fingers, but Graves knew he wouldn't stay hidden for long. He had rattled Kincaid's cage, and now it was only a matter of time before Kincaid made his next move. The sound of Graves' footsteps fades as he exits the alleyway, leaving the rain and shadows behind. Police station, early morning. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot, distant footsteps from someone else moving in the dark. Graves slows his pace, listening intently. The soft murmur of voices fills the air, phones ringing in the distance, the hum of office activity growing as the station comes to life in the early hours of the morning. Graves walks through the station, his footsteps tired but determined. Back at the station, Graves went over everything again, the connections, the clues, the players in this deadly game. Victoria Langston's murder had been the first move, but it was clear now that Mr. H was playing a much bigger game. And Kincaid was just another pawn on the board. Graves stops at his desk, flipping through papers. The sound of a chair creaking as he sits down heavily. Charlie had been digging up more information on Kincaid, trying to track his movements. He handed Graves a folder filled with old reports and surveillance photos. Kincaid had been involved in several high-profile cases, but every time he had slipped away, leaving nothing behind but bodies. The sound of a folder being opened, papers rustling. The footsteps stop. A tense silence fills the air, broken only by the sound of rain and wind. Graves' breathing grows heavier, tension building. Graves studied the photos, his eyes narrowing as he recognized some of the faces. Kincaid hadn't just been cleaning up after Mr. H. He had been doing his dirty work for years. But there was something hidden in the layers of Kincaid's past. The sound of a phone ringing interrupts the moment. Graves answers, his voice tense but controlled. The call came from an unexpected source, Harrison. He wanted to meet. He had information on Kincaid, something that Graves needed to hear. But Graves knew better than to trust a man like Harrison. This meeting could be a trap. Or worse. Graves hangs up the phone, his chair scraping against the floor as he stands. Graves didn't have much of a choice. If Harrison had information on Kincaid, he needed to hear it. But he would go into this meeting prepared, knowing that in this game, everyone had something to lose. The meeting, evening. The sound of soft jazz music plays in the background, mingling with the quiet murmur of voices in a dimly lit bar. Glasses clink softly as drinks are poured. Graves steps into the bar, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The bar was quiet, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Graves spotted Harrison sitting in the back, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He moved through the room cautiously, every sense on high alert. Graves sits down across from Harrison, the sound of the chair scraping lightly on the floor. The tension is thick between them. Harrison didn't waste time. "Kincaid's a problem," he said, his voice low but steady. "He's gone rogue. He's no longer just following orders. He's taking matters into his own hands." Graves remained silent, letting Harrison continue. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You want Kincaid? I can help you find him. But you need to understand he's not working alone anymore. There are others involved, and if you're not careful, you'll end up like Victoria." The sound of ice clinking in Harrison's glass as he takes a slow sip. Graves listened, but he didn't trust a word of it. Harrison had his own agenda, he always did. But if what he said was true, then Kincaid was more dangerous than Graves had realized. The sound of a glass being set down softly on the table. Graves stands, his chair scraping the floor again as he pushes it back. As Graves left the bar, Harrison's words echoed in his mind. Kincaid wasn't just following orders anymore, he was making his own moves, and that made him unpredictable. But it also made him vulnerable. Graves' footsteps echo through the bar as he exits, the quiet murmur of voices fading behind him. Rooftop chase, night. The sound of rain intensifies, now pounding heavily against the rooftops of the city. Graves' footsteps echo as he runs across a narrow rooftop, the wind howling through the night. Graves had followed the lead Harrison had given him, and it had led him here to a rooftop chase through the darkened city. Kincaid was close, just ahead, his silhouette barely visible in the rain, but Graves wasn't giving up. Not now. The sound of heavy breathing, shoes slipping on the wet rooftop. Graves' footsteps quicken as he closes the gap. Kincaid moved fast, but Graves was faster. He could see the man now, his coat flapping in the wind, his movements frantic as he tried to escape. but there was nowhere left to run. The sound of a gunshot rings out, echoing across the rooftop. Graves dives to the side, his body hitting the wet surface with a thud. The shot missed, but only by inches. Graves rolled to his feet, gun drawn, his eyes locking on Kincaid as he took aim. But Kincaid didn't fire again. He just stood there, rain dripping from his face, a cold smile on his lips. The sound of rain and wind continues, the tension thick in the air. "You should have stayed out of this, Graves," Kincaid said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "But now it's too late." Graves doesn't respond, his gun still trained on Kincaid. The two men stand there for a moment, rain pouring down around them. For a moment, everything was still. And then, without warning, Kincaid turned and leapt off the rooftop, disappearing into the shadows below. Graves ran to the edge, but Kincaid was gone, swallowed by the night. Graves stands there for a moment, breathing heavily, rain still pouring down. The sound of distant sirens wails faintly in the background. The sound of typing fills the air again, rhythmic and deliberate. The rain continues softly in the background. Somewhere in the city, in a darkened room, a message was being sent. Fingers tapped against a keyboard, a conversation unfolding between unseen players. "Graves is getting closer," the message read. "Kincaid failed. Prepare for the next move." The typing stops. The faint sound of rain grows louder, filling the silence. Graves had come closer than ever before. But Kincaid had slipped away once again. The game wasn't over yet, and the people pulling the strings were already preparing their next move. But Graves wouldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Next time, on Silent Shadows. The sound of rain persists, now heavier than before, pounding against windows and rooftops. Thunder rumbles faintly in the distance, adding to the dark, tense atmosphere. A low, suspenseful melody plays in the background. Detective Ethan Graves had come closer to the truth than anyone ever had. Kincaid, Mr. H's enforcer, had slipped through his grasp once again, but Graves wasn't backing down. The game was more dangerous now, the stakes higher, and every step he took brought him closer to the edge. The sound of a phone ringing cuts through the storm. Graves answers quickly, his voice implied through the narrator. Graves' apartment, night. Rain beats against the windows as the phone call continues. Graves is pacing, his footsteps slow but deliberate as he listens to the voice on the other end. The call was from Charlie, another lead on Kincaid, but this time it was different. Kincaid had been spotted meeting with someone important, someone Graves hadn't expected, Harrison. The two men had been seen together in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Graves grabs his coat, the sound of the fabric rustling, the door creaking open as he leaves. Graves felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. Harrison had claimed to want Kincaid stopped, but now it was clear Harrison wasn't just another pawn. He was part of the game, and it was time to confront him. The door clicks shut, and the sound of rain grows louder as Graves steps outside. Abandoned building, midnight. The rain pours heavily on the roof of the building, dripping through cracks in the ceiling. Graves' footsteps echo in the empty space as he moves cautiously through the building. The wind howls faintly outside, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The abandoned building was falling apart, cracked walls, broken windows, and an eerie silence that hung in the air like a ghost. Graves moved through the darkness, his senses heightened, knowing that Kincaid and Harrison could be waiting for him. Every shadow felt alive, every sound amplified by the tension. Graves slows his pace, the sound of quiet voices up ahead. He pauses, listening closely. Graves heard them before he saw them, Kincaid and Harrison, their voices low, discussing something that chilled Graves to the core. They were planning something big. A final move that would tie up all the loose ends. The sound of quiet conversation drifts through the air, though the words are muffled and indistinct. Graves moves closer, his breathing steady but tense. Graves edged closer, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. But then, just as he was about to get a clear view, a floorboard creaked beneath his foot. The conversation stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. The sound of guns being drawn echoes sharply in the empty building. Graves freezes. Kincaid's voice cut through the silence. "You should have stayed away, Graves," he said. "Now you've walked right into the lion's den." The sound of footsteps approaching quickly. Graves draws his gun, stepping out from the shadows. Graves stepped into the open, gun raised, eyes locked on Kincaid and Harrison. But Kincaid just smiled, his cold eyes gleaming with amusement. "You're in over your head, Detective," Kincaid said. "You don't know how deep this goes." Graves remains silent, but the tension in the air is thick. The wind whistles through the broken windows, and the rain pounds against the building. For a moment, everything was still. Graves knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. But he also knew he was so close to unraveling the truth. And he wasn't going to let Kincaid and Harrison walk away. Not this time. The sound of heavy footsteps as Kincaid moves forward, his presence menacing. Just as Kincaid stepped toward him, a loud crash echoed through the building. The ceiling above them groaned under the weight of the rain and wind, and debris began to fall around them. Kincaid and Harrison scrambled, caught off guard by the sudden chaos. The sound of debris crashing to the floor, the groaning of the building under strain. Graves moves quickly, taking advantage of the moment. Graves saw his chance. He moved fast, grabbing a metal pipe from the ground and knocking Kincaid's gun out of his hand. The two men collided, struggling for control as the building creaked and shifted around them. The sound of a fierce struggle grappling, grunts, and the clash of metal on metal. Graves and Kincaid fight for control. Kincaid was strong, but Graves had the upper hand. He slammed Kincaid against the wall, pinning him down just as Harrison tried to make his escape. The sound of footsteps running, distant as Harrison makes a break for it. Graves hesitates for a moment, breathing heavily. Graves knew he couldn't let Harrison go. He had to make a choice chase after the man who could lead him to Mr. H, or deal with Kincaid once and for all. Graves breathes heavily, his decision hanging in the air for a moment. In the end, the choice was clear. Graves handcuffed Kincaid, securing him to a metal beam, and ran after Harrison. But the building was crumbling fast, and the rain only made it worse. By the time Graves reached the exit, Harrison was gone, vanished into the night. The sound of heavy breathing, Graves standing in the rain just outside the building. The wind howls, and the building creaks ominously behind him. Graves stood in the rain, his heart pounding, frustration burning inside him. Harrison had slipped away, but Kincaid was finally in custody. The enforcer's game was over, but the man pulling the strings was still out there, still waiting in the shadows. The sound of distant sirens approaching as Graves pulls himself together and steps back inside to confront Kincaid. Interrogation room, morning. The quiet hum of the police station fills the air, faint voices in the background. The rain has slowed to a drizzle outside. Graves sits across from Kincaid in a cold, sterile interrogation room. A low buzz of a flickering light overhead adds to the tension. Kincaid sat across from Graves, his hands cuffed to the table, his expression calm and unreadable. Despite being caught, there was no fear in his eyes, only the cold, calculating look of a man who had been playing this game for far too long. A moment of silence as Graves stares at Kincaid, waiting for him to speak. Graves didn't need to ask the questions. He already knew the answers. Kincaid had been following orders for years, cleaning up the messes Mr. H left behind. But now, Kincaid had gone rogue, making his own moves, taking matters into his own hands. It was a dangerous game, and Kincaid had lost. The sound of Kincaid shifting in his seat, his voice implied through the narrator. "You think you've won?" Kincaid asked, his voice low and mocking. "You're just a pawn, Graves. Mr. H is still out there, and he's already making his next move." Graves remains silent, but the tension between them grows. Graves leaned in, his eyes locked on Kincaid's. "Tell me where to find him," Graves demanded, his voice steady. But Kincaid only smiled a cold, twisted smile that sent a chill through the room. "You'll never find him," Kincaid said, "but he'll find you. And when he does, you won't even see it coming." The sound of the chair scraping as Graves stands up, the tension thick as he steps away from the table. Kincaid's words hung in the air, a warning that echoed through Graves' mind. The game wasn't over, not yet, and Mr. H was still out there, waiting for his moment. The door creaks open as Graves leaves the interrogation room, the sound of rain faintly returning in the background. Rooftop, night. The rain has stopped, but the wind still howls softly across the rooftop. Graves stands alone, looking out over the city, his mind racing with everything he's learned. Graves stood on the rooftop, the city stretching out before him, a maze of lights and shadows. He had come so close capturing Kincaid, unraveling part of the mystery, but Mr. H was still a ghost, slipping through his fingers. The man behind it all was still out there, watching, waiting for Graves to make his next move. A long pause as Graves breathes deeply, the wind howling around him. But Graves wasn't giving up. He had come too far, risked too much. He knew that finding Mr. H would be his toughest challenge yet, but he was ready. No matter the cost, he would bring the man behind the shadows to justice. The sound of a car engine revving in the distance, the wind growing softer as the scene fades out. The familiar sound of typing returns, rhythmic and deliberate. A phone rings faintly in the background. In a darkened room, far from the city lights, the game continued. Fingers tapped against a keyboard, messages sent, orders given. "Kincaid is gone," the message read. "But Graves is still in play. Prepare for the final move." The sound of typing stops abruptly, and the faint sound of rain resumes. Graves had taken down one of Mr. H's most dangerous enforcers, but the fight was far from over. The shadows were closing in, and the man behind it all was making his final move. But Graves wasn't done yet. He was ready for whatever came next. Next time, on Silent Shadows. The sound of wind howling across the rooftops. The rain has stopped, but the city remains soaked, its streets slick and reflective. A slow, eerie melody plays in the background, building tension. Detective Ethan Graves had spent years chasing ghosts through the darkened streets of the city, but none had been as elusive as Mr. H. With Kincaid in custody, Graves had come closer to uncovering the truth than anyone ever had. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game became. Now the shadows were closing in, and the hand pulling the strings was about to make its move. The sound of a phone ringing cuts through the air. Graves answers quickly. "Police station, morning." The hum of the police station fills the earphones ringing, faint voices in the background. Graves is standing in his office, phone pressed to his ear, his voice implied through the narrator. The call was from Charlie, and it wasn't good. Harrison had gone completely off the radar. Since the confrontation in the abandoned building, he had vanished without a trace. But there was more. Someone had been watching Graves' apartment, his office, even his phone calls. He had known he was under surveillance, but this time it was different. The watchers weren't just gathering information, they were preparing to strike. Graves sets the phone down, his footsteps quickening as he heads out of the office. Graves could feel the pressure mounting. The walls were closing in, and every move he made felt like a step deeper into enemy territory. But he wasn't going to back down, not now. Not when he was so close. The sound of his footsteps echo through the hallway as he leaves the station. Graves' apartment, afternoon. The sound of a key turning in the lock, the door creaking open. Graves steps inside, his senses on high alert. The faint hum of the city outside seeps in through the windows. Graves had come home to find everything exactly as he left it. But something felt wrong off. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, like a presence lingering just beyond his reach. The sound of quiet footsteps as Graves moves cautiously through the apartment. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Then he saw it, a small black device, tucked neatly under his desk. A listening device. Graves had been right. Someone had been in his apartment, watching, waiting. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. They were closer than he had realized. The sound of Graves removing the device, his breathing steady but tense. The faint ticking of a clock echoes in the background. Graves knew what this meant. The people hunting him weren't playing around anymore. They were preparing for the endgame. And now, it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Graves drops the device into a small evidence bag, his footsteps echoing as he leaves the apartment, closing the door behind him. Interrogation room, evening. The sound of a heavy door creaking open. The room is quiet, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Kincaid sits calmly in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. Graves steps inside, his footsteps deliberate, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Kincaid hadn't said much since his arrest. He had been cool, composed, almost smug, as if he were waiting for something. But Graves wasn't interested in waiting anymore. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Graves pulls a chair out and sits across from Kincaid, the tension thick between them. Graves leaned in, his eyes locked on Kincaid's. "Where's Harrison?" Graves demanded, his voice steady but forceful. Kincaid's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something Graves hadn't seen before. Fear. A moment of silence. The ticking of the clock in the background grows louder. "You still don't get it, do you?" Kincaid said, his voice low but taunting. "Harrison isn't the one you should be worried about. Mister, he's everywhere. He's been watching you since the beginning." Graves clenches his fists, but his voice remains calm. Graves knew Kincaid was trying to rattle him, but the truth was, it was working. Mr. H was always one step ahead, always in control. But this time, Graves wasn't going to let him slip away. Graves stands up, his chair scraping the floor as he pushes it back. Graves leaned over the table, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to tell me where to find him, Kincaid, or I'll make sure you go down for everything, everybody, every cover-up, every crime he's committed. You'll take the fall for all of it." The sound of Kincaid shifting in his seat, his calm demeanor faltering for the first time. Kincaid hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. Then finally he spoke. "There's a meeting tonight," he said. "The old Pier 17. Harrison will be there. So will Mr. H, but if you go, Graves, you won't make it out alive." Graves doesn't respond, his footsteps echoing as he leaves the room. The door closes behind him with a soft click. Pier 17, night. The sound of waves crashing softly against the wooden pier. The wind whistles through the abandoned docks, and the faint creak of old wood adds to the eerie atmosphere. Graves' footsteps are slow and cautious as he moves through the shadows. Pier 17 had once been a hub of activity, but now it was little more than a forgotten relic of the past, quiet, abandoned, and shrouded in darkness. Graves moved carefully, his senses heightened. This was it, the meeting place. The place where it would all go down. The sound of muffled voices up ahead, faint but growing louder. Graves stops, listening closely. He heard them before he saw them, Harrison, and another man whose voice Graves didn't recognize. It had to be Mr. H. Graves edged closer, staying in the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance, his only chance to finally bring Mr. H. into the light. The sound of quiet conversation filters through the air, indistinct but tense. Graves takes a slow breath, steadying himself. But just as Graves was about to step forward, he felt a presence behind him. The barrel of a gun pressed against his back, and a low, gravelly voice whispered in his ear. "I told you, Graves. You shouldn't have come." The sound of Graves breathing heavily, the tension building as the man, likely one of Kincaid's men, tightens his grip on the gun. Graves had known it was a trap, but now he was caught in it, and there was no easy way out. He could feel the pressure of the gun against his spine, the cold steel pressing into him like a knife's edge. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind, the voice of Mr. H. is heard faintly now, calm and collected. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Let him go," it said, cool and confident. Graves felt the gun lower, and the man behind him stepped away. For the first time, Graves turned to see the face of the man he had been chasing for so long. A pause, the sound of the wind howling across the pier. Mr. H. stood before him, a man who looked nothing like the shadowy figure Graves had imagined. He was calm, composed, almost casual, but there was an unmistakable air of danger about him. "You've been very persistent, Detective," Mr. Ash said, his voice smooth and mocking. "But I'm afraid this is where your chase ends." Graves doesn't respond immediately, but his hand tightens around the grip of his gun. Mr. H. smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill down Graves' spine. "You've been looking for me, Graves," he said. "But you never stop to ask yourself why." The sound of the waves crashing grows louder as the tension between them thickens. Graves stepped forward, his voice steady. "I'm not here for answers, Mr. H. I'm here for justice." But Mr. H. only laughed, a quiet, sinister sound that echoed across the pier. The wind howls again, the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. "Justice," Mr. H. repeated, his voice dripping with amusement. "There is no justice, Graves. Only power. And the power in this city belongs to me." Graves remains silent, his gun still drawn, but the situation is slipping out of his control. The conversation was over. Graves knew it, and so did Mr. H. The man turned, walking away into the shadows as his men closed in on Graves, their weapons raised. The sound of guns being cocked, footsteps moving in closer. Graves stands his ground. But Graves wasn't about to back down. Not now, not after everything he had been through. He took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The sound of a gunshot rings out, loud and sharp. The scene cuts to black, the sound of waves crashing and the wind howling as the episode fades out. The sound of typing returns, rhythmic and deliberate. A phone rings faintly in the background. In a dark room, far from the chaos of the pier, the game continued. Messages were sent, orders given. "Graves is in play," the message read. "Proceed with the next phase." The sound of typing stops, the faint sound of rain returns. Graves had come face to face with Mr. H, but the game was far from over. The final move was being prepared, and the stakes had never been higher. The shadows were closing in, and only one player would walk away. Next time, on silent shadows. The episode opens with the sound of soft rain falling. The slow, rhythmic beating of a heart echoes in the background, deep, steady thuds. The atmosphere is heavy, the tension thick. A slow, suspenseful melody builds underneath, drawing the listener in profound. The game had never been this dangerous. Detective Ethan Graves had finally come face to face with Mr. H, but the confrontation had been anything but simple. Surrounded, outnumbered, and caught in a deadly trap, Graves had been forced into a fight for survival. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The answers were close, buried just beneath the surface. All Graves had to do was survive long enough to uncover them. The sound of heavy breathing breaks through the rain. The breathing is strained, labored, but steady. The sound of footsteps echoes in the background, growing closer and closer. The soft sound of rain continues. The rhythmic sound of Graves' breathing is heard, still labored, as he slowly regains his senses. The faint sound of waves crashing against the pier lingers in the background. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoes in Graves' mind, repeating as if haunting him. The gunshot had shattered the night, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Graves felt the impact sharp, hot, but it wasn't fatal. The bullet had grazed his side, missing vital organs by inches, but pain was the least of his worries. The real threat was still out there, hidden in the shadows. The sound of Graves groaning softly as he pulls himself up. His breathing is heavy, but determined. Graves forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain that burned through his side. The scene around him was a mess. Mr. H's men were gone, vanished into the night, leaving behind only silence and the lingering scent of gunpowder. But Mr. H, he had escaped once again. Graves takes a few shaky steps forward, the sound of his shoes splashing through puddles on the pier. Graves had come closer than ever before, but Mr. H had slipped through his fingers. And now, all Graves had left were questions that needed answers. Fast. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance grows louder as Graves makes his way off the pier. His breathing slows as he steadies himself. Police station, late night. The familiar hum of the police station fills the earphones ringing. The distant murmur of voices, the soft tapping of keyboards. The atmosphere is subdued, tense. Graves' footsteps echo as he walks through the station, heading toward his office. Back at the station, Graves could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had come so close to bringing Mr. H down, but every step forward seemed to drag him deeper into a web of deception and lies. But he wasn't ready to quit, not now. Not when the truth was within reach. Graves enters his office, the door creaking softly behind him as he sits at his desk. The sound of a file being opened. Graves flips through papers, his breath steady but tense. Graves sank into his chair, his mind racing as he replayed the events of the night over and over again. The meeting at Pier 17 had been a setup, another game orchestrated by Mr. H. But there had to be something he missed, something that could lead him closer to uncovering the truth. Graves pulled out everything he had on Mr. H: photos, reports, old case files. He had pieced together a network of lies and half-truths, but there was still one piece missing, and that piece was the key to everything. A soft knock on the door interrupts his thoughts. The door creaks open, and Charlie steps inside, his voice implied through the narrator. Charlie stepped into the room, his face pale but determined. "Detective," he said, "we've got something." The tech team recovered more data from Kincaid's phone. It's encrypted, but they're making progress. There's a name, a location. Graves looks up, the weight of exhaustion heavy in his expression, but there's a flicker of hope in his eyes. Graves nodded, the gears in his mind turning. A name, a location. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had before. And now, it was time to put the pieces together. The sound of Charlie placing a file on the desk. Graves flips through it, his focus sharpening. The file contained everything they had on Mr. H's network businesses, connections, hidden assets. And at the center of it all was one name, Victor Hawley. It was an alias, but it was more than just a cover. It was the key to everything. Graves stands, the sound of his chair sliding back as he grabs his coat. Graves had his lead Victor Hawley, the man behind Mr. H, the man who had been pulling the strings from the beginning. And now, Graves knew where to find him. The safe house, early morning. The sound of gravel crunching under tires as Graves drives down a narrow, isolated road. The faint hum of the engine is heard, mixing with the occasional rustle of wind. The air is tense, heavy with anticipation. The location Charlie had uncovered led Graves to a remote safe house on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of place where things went unnoticed. The kind of place where secrets were kept hidden. Graves' car engine cuts off, and the door creaks open. The sound of gravel under his feet echoes as he approaches the safe house. The safe house loomed before him, dark and silent. Graves approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. Every instinct told him this was the place, but it also told him that he wasn't alone. The sound of a door creaking open slowly. Graves steps inside, the atmosphere tense and oppressive. The inside of the safe house was cold, dark. Graves could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. It was as if the walls themselves held secrets that had been buried for far too long. Footsteps echo through the house as Graves moves deeper inside. The floor creaks underfoot. Then, he heard a faint sound coming from one of the rooms up ahead. Graves drew his gun, his heart pounding as he moved closer to the source of the noise. The sound of a door creaking open, the tension thickening. Graves pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. And there, sitting at a table, was Victor Hawley, the man behind Mr. H, the man Graves had been chasing all this time. Hale's voice is calm, steady, and calculated. His presence is commanding, yet unnervingly casual. Hawley didn't flinch when Graves entered the room. He simply smiled a cold, knowing smile. "I've been expecting you, Detective," Hawley said, his voice smooth and unbothered. "I was wondering when you'd finally catch up." Graves steps forward, his gun still drawn, his voice steady but filled with determination. Graves didn't waste time. "It's over, Hawley," he said, his voice firm. "You've been running for too long. But now it ends." Hale's smile doesn't falter, his demeanor is calm, even amused. But Hawley just chuckled, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous intelligence. "You think you've won?" Hawley asked, his tone mocking. "This is just the beginning, Detective. You're still playing my game." A long pause as the tension builds. The ticking of a clock grows louder in the background. Graves stared at Hawley, his mind racing. This was it, the man he had been chasing for so long, finally cornered. But something felt wrong. Something wasn't adding up. Hale's voice grows quieter, more insidious. "You see, Graves," Hawley continued, "this was never about me. It's about power control, and I've already won. Everything you've done, every move you've made. It's all been part of my plan." Graves tightens his grip on his gun, his voice low and dangerous. Graves wasn't going to let Hawley talk his way out of this. "You're done, Hawley," Graves said, his voice hard. "There's no more running. No more games." The sound of Hawley standing slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His smile fades, replaced by a steely resolve. "Perhaps," Hawley said, his voice quieter now. "But before this ends, Detective, there's one more thing you need to know." The sound of footsteps approaching quickly, tension spiking. And before Graves could react, the door behind him burst open. More of Hale's men flooded into the room, their guns trained on Graves. He had walked into a trap. Graves breathes heavily. The sound of guns being cocked fills the air. Holly smiled again, a triumphant smile, filled with the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. "It's over, Graves," Holly said. "You played your part well. But this is where it ends." The sound of footsteps moving closer as Hale's men close in around Graves. But Graves wasn't done yet. He still had one card left to play. And as the tension in the room reached its peak, Graves made his move. The sound of a struggle gunfire erupts, chaos breaking out in the room. Graves fights back, the tension reaching its climax. The escape. Dawn. The sound of heavy breathing, footsteps pounding against pavement. Graves is running, the sound of distant sirens wailing in the background. The rain has started to fall again, softly at first, then growing heavier. Graves had barely made it out alive. The safe house was behind him now, but Holly was still out there, still pulling the strings, still controlling the game. Graves had escaped the trap, but the danger was far from over. Graves slows his pace, his breathing steadying as he finds cover in a dark alleyway. The city was waking up, but for Graves, the night was far from over. Holly had made his move, but the final confrontation was still to come. And this time, Graves wasn't going to let him get away. The sound of rain continues to fall, the city slowly waking up around him. Graves leans against the wall, catching his breath. Graves knew the next move had to be his. Holly was still out there, planning, waiting. But now, Graves had something he hadn't had before: clarity. The game wasn't over, but it was nearing its end. And Graves was ready for the final battle. The sound of typing fills the air again, rhythmic and deliberate. A phone rings faintly in the background. In a dark room, far from the chaos of the night, the game continued. Messages were sent, plans were made. Graves escaped, the message read. Prepare for the final phase. The sound of typing stops abruptly, the rain continuing softly in the background. Graves had walked into the lion's den and come out alive. But the final move was still to come. Mr. H wasn't finished yet, and the shadows were closing in. The final battle was approaching, and only one player would survive. Next time, on Silent Shadows. The episode opens with the sound of heavy rain pounding against the pavement, wind howling through narrow alleys. The distant hum of the city pulses in the background. A slow, eerie melody builds underneath, dark and foreboding. The city felt different tonight. The storm had returned, washing the streets in darkness, casting shadows that twisted and turned with every gust of wind. For Detective Ethan Graves, the chase was almost over. Mr. H. Victor Hall had eluded him for too long, but now the game was nearing its end, and Graves was ready to make his final move. A sound of a car engine revving faintly in the distance. Graves' footsteps echo as he walks down a wet, deserted street. The streets of the city, night. The rain continues to fall, harder now, splashing against the pavement. Graves' footsteps are steady, purposeful as he walks down a narrow street, his coat flapping in the wind. Graves had spent the entire night tracking Hale's network, following the leads, tracing the money, uncovering every connection. It had taken him deeper into the shadows than he had ever gone before, but now he had what he needed. He knew where Holly would be, and this time there would be no more running. Graves pauses, the sound of his footsteps stopping as he looks up at an old, imposing building, the location of Hale's final stronghold. The building loomed before him, a decaying relic of the city's past. It had once been a place of power, but now it stood abandoned, crumbling into ruin. Inside, Holly was waiting. Graves could feel it. This was where it would all end. Graves takes a deep breath, steeling himself for what's to come. His footsteps resume as he approaches the entrance. Inside Hale's stronghold, night. The door creaks open, and Graves steps inside. The air is thick with the smell of damp and decay. Water drips steadily from the ceiling, and the wind whistles through broken windows. Graves' footsteps echo as he moves deeper into the building. The inside of the building was dark empty, save for the echo of his own footsteps. But Graves knew better than to trust the silence. He could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. Hale's men were here, hidden, waiting for their moment to strike. Graves' breathing is steady, controlled. The sound of a door creaks softly in the distance. Graves' senses sharpen, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Graves moved carefully through the darkened hallways, his gun drawn, his senses on high alert. He knew that Holly would have planned for this. He had always been 2 steps ahead, orchestrating every move from the shadows. But tonight, the advantage belonged to Graves. Graves rounds a corner, and suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoes behind him, quick and light. He stops, turning sharply, gun raised. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, one of Hale's men. His eyes were cold, his face hidden by shadows, but Graves didn't hesitate. A single gunshot echoed through the hall, and the man crumpled to the floor. The sound of a body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Graves' breathing remains steady, his gun still raised as he steps over the fallen figure. Graves moved forward, deeper into the building, his resolve unshaken. He was close now, he could feel it. Holly was waiting for him, but Graves wasn't afraid. He had been preparing for this moment since the beginning. Hale's lair, the final confrontation. The atmosphere shifts as Graves enters a large, dimly lit room. The sound of dripping water fades slightly, replaced by a low, steady hum, almost mechanical. The room is dark, the only light coming from flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. And then Graves found him. Victor Holly, Mr. Hake, stood in the center of the room, waiting. The man who had orchestrated everything. The man who had manipulated, murdered, and twisted the city to his will. But tonight, his game was over. Hale's voice is calm, steady, and dangerous. His presence commands the room, but there's an air of tension. Hale knows the end is near. Detective Graves, Holly said, his voice smooth as ever. But there was something else in it this time, an edge of uncertainty. You've come a long way. I must admit, I didn't think you'd make it this far. Graves steps forward, his gun trained on Holly, his voice steady but filled with determination. It's over, Holly, Graves said, his voice hard as steel. This time, you're not getting away. Holly chuckles softly, a cold, almost mocking sound. He doesn't move, his hands remaining at his sides. But Holly wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. You still don't understand, do you, Graves? Holly said, his smile fading into something darker. You think this is about me? This is bigger than you or me. The city is built on power, on control. And I am the one who controls it. Graves narrows his eyes, his grip on the gun tightening. The tension in the room thickens. Graves didn't flinch. The game's over, Holly. You don't control anything anymore. Hale's smile returns, this time colder, more calculated. He steps forward slowly, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. You think you've won? Holly asked, his voice low and dangerous. You think taking me down will change anything? The city will always belong to men like me. I'm just the face of it. Take me down, and someone else will take my place. Maybe, Graves said, but not tonight. Tonight, it ends with you. Graves steps closer, his gun still raised. His voice is sharp, filled with resolve. The sound of the wind howling through the broken windows grows louder, almost drowning out the sound of Hale's next words. Hale's smile faltered for the first time. He could see it in Graves' eyes, the determination, the unwavering resolve. And for the first time, Haile realized that his time had run out. There's a long pause, the tension reaching its peak. The sound of a gunshot rings out loud and sharp echoing through the room. Then, silence. Aftermath, early morning. The rain has stopped. The sound of soft wind blowing through the city streets fills the air. The distant hum of police sirens wails softly in the background. Graves' footsteps echo as he walks away from the building, his breathing steady but heavy with exhaustion. The night had ended, but the echoes of the battle still lingered in the air. Victor Haile was gone. His empire had crumbled, and the game he had played for so long was finally over. But for Graves, the weight of it all was just beginning to settle in. Graves slows his pace, his footsteps softer now as he walks through the quiet streets of the city. The city felt different now, quieter. The power Haile had wielded for so long had been broken. But Graves knew that the shadows would always remain. There would always be another threat, another enemy lurking just beyond the light. Graves stops, taking a deep breath as he looks out over the city. The sound of the wind grows softer, the tension easing slightly. But tonight, at least, the shadows had been driven back. Graves had won. The city was safe. For now. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Charlie's voice is implied through the narrator. Charlie appeared at his side, his face tired but relieved. "You did it, detective," he said quietly. "It's over." Graves turns to look at him, the weight of everything heavy in his eyes. Graves nodded, but he knew the truth. It wasn't really over. Not completely. The city would never be truly free of men like Haile. But for tonight, it was enough. The sound of police sirens fades into the distance as the two men stand in silence, the wind blowing softly around them. The sound of typing fills the air again, rhythmic and deliberate. The atmosphere is quieter now, more subdued. A phone rings faintly in the background, but this time it goes unanswered. In a dark room, far from the chaos of the night, the game had finally ended. The pieces had been removed from the board, and the players had fallen, but the shadows never truly disappeared. Somewhere in the city, a new game was already beginning. The sound of typing stops abruptly, the soft wind continuing in the background. Graves had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The city was safe for now, but the shadows would return. And when they did, Graves would be ready, next time, on Silent Shadows. The episode opens with the soft sound of wind blowing across the city. The rain has finally stopped, and the streets are quiet. The sound of distant traffic hums in the background. A slow, melancholic piano melody begins to play, setting the tone for reflection and resolution. The storm had passed, but the weight of the night still lingered in the air. For Detective Ethan Graves, the battle against Mr. H had finally come to an end. Victor Hale, the man who had controlled the shadows, was gone. But the scars left behind were deep, and the echoes of the fight would never truly fade. In the light of dawn, Graves stood alone, victorious but changed. The sound of footsteps echoes softly as Graves walks down a quiet street, the first rays of morning light breaking through the clouds. The city streets, early morning. The wind is gentle, the city calm as the sun begins to rise. Graves' footsteps are slow and steady, his breathing deep and contemplative. The city felt different now. The shadows had receded, leaving behind a sense of quiet that Graves hadn't felt in years. But beneath the calm, there was still darkness. Holly may have been defeated, but Graves knew the truth. There would always be men like him. The city would never be truly free of the shadows. Graves slows his pace, looking up at the rising sun. The warmth of the morning contrasts with the cold, dark world he's fought through. But for now, it was enough. For now, the city could breathe again. The sound of a car pulling up slowly behind him. The engine hums softly before cutting off. A car door opens and closes, and Charlie's voice is implied through the narrator. Charlie had come to find him, his face filled with relief and exhaustion. "It's over," Charlie said quietly. "We got them all. Hale's empire is finished." Graves turns to face Charlie, his expression weary but satisfied. The tension that has followed him through this entire journey seems to lift, even if just for a moment. Graves nodded, but there was no celebration in his heart. There was only a quiet sense of finality. The job was done, but the cost had been high. Lives had been lost, trust had been broken, and Graves had been forced to confront parts of himself he hadn't wanted to see. The sound of the wind dies down, leaving only the quiet hum of the city in the background. Charlie looked at him, his eyes filled with admiration and concern. "You did good, Detective," Charlie said. "You stopped him. That's what matters." Graves gives a small nod, his voice implied through the narration. But Graves didn't respond right away. He just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's never really over, Charlie," Graves said. "There's always another fight. Always another shadow." The two men stand in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey hanging between them. Graves' apartment, later that morning. The sound of a key turning in a lock. The door creaks open, and Graves steps into his apartment. The atmosphere is quieter now, almost peaceful. The soft ticking of a clock is heard in the background. Graves returned to his apartment, a place that had once been his sanctuary, but now felt like something else, a reminder of everything he had lost along the way. The nights spent alone, chasing leads, facing danger, all in the name of justice. But what had it really cost him? Graves moves across the room, setting his coat down on a chair. He takes a deep breath, the weight of the entire journey heavy on his shoulders. The city was safer now, but the price had been steep. And as Graves looked around his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had won the battle, but at what cost? Graves sits down in his chair, the sound of it creaking softly beneath him. His breathing is deep, steady, but there's an unmistakable sense of exhaustion in the air. The final meeting, Graves and Claire. The soft sound of footsteps approaches the door, followed by a gentle knock. Graves stands and walks to the door, opening it to reveal Dr. Claire Mason. Her voice is implied through the narrator. Claire had come to see him. She had been with him through it all, helping him with the case, uncovering the evidence, and standing by his side when everything seemed darkest. And now she had come to offer him something more, something beyond the shadows. Graves steps aside to let Claire in, her footsteps soft as she walks into the apartment. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "You did it, Ethan," she said quietly. "You brought him down, but you can't keep living like this. Not forever." Graves nods slowly, his expression introspective. Graves knew she was right. The fight had consumed him for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to live outside of it. But now, with Holly gone, there was a chance for something different. A chance to step out of the shadows and into the light. Claire steps closer, her voice soft and caring. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Claire said. "You don't have to carry all of it by yourself." There's a long pause, the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. Graves takes a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. For the first time in a long time, Graves allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of the case. He allowed himself to feel hope. Claire places a hand on Graves' shoulder, offering him a quiet strength that he hadn't realized he needed. Graves looks toward the future. The sound of wind blowing gently through the city streets returns. The morning sun has risen higher now, casting a warm glow over the city. Graves stands at the window, looking out over the skyline, his expression contemplative but peaceful. The city was still there, still filled with shadows and secrets, but Graves knew that he had made a difference. He had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. And now, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about the future. The sound of the wind grows softer, the atmosphere calm and reflective. He didn't know what came next, but for now, that was okay. He had won a victory, and even though the war would never truly end, he was ready to face whatever came next with Claire by his side and a renewed sense of purpose. Graves turns away from the window, his steps lighter now as he moves across the room. For so long, the shadows had consumed him. But now, in the light of dawn, Graves had found something he hadn't expected. He had found hope. The sound of the piano melody returns, soft and haunting, but with a hint of warmth. The scene begins to fade out. The city moves forward. The sound of the city picks up again, cars driving by, distant voices, the hustle and bustle of life returning to the streets. The city is waking up, moving forward, just as Graves is. The city never truly sleeps. There will always be shadows lurking in the corners, waiting for their moment to strike. But for now, the light had returned. And for Detective Ethan Graves, that was enough. The music swells slightly, carrying the listener through the final moments of the story. Graves had found peace, at least for a little while. And even though the darkness would never truly disappear, he was ready to face it again and again. Because that's what it meant to be a detective in a city like this. You fight, you survive, and you keep moving forward. Next time, on Silent Shadows.